hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome back to Season 3 of Hidden in Plain Sight, the series that explores the life and work of Christopher Marlowe, famed Elizabethan playwright and dramatist, and possibly spy. In this series, we posit that Christopher Marlowe did not die in 1593, but rather that he escaped with the help of well-placed members of the intelligence network under the Lord Burleigh. I'm Julian Ng, your host for this series, and with me are our friendly resident Marlowe scholars, Dr. Peter Hodges and Miss Carol Paxton. Nice to see you both again.
Thank you, Julian.
Right, yes, thank you, and hello.
Hello, and let's do a quick recap, shall we? In our last episode, we introduced a new topic by asking the question, could Christopher Marlowe have written the first 17 sonnets in the collection of sonnets attributed to William Shakespeare? Peter presented us with some background on the period in 1590 when the Lord Burleigh was seeking to marry his granddaughter, Elizabeth the Vere, to the richest man in England, the soon-to-be 17-year-old Earl of Southampton. Carol then provided some background on the history of sonnets and sonnet writing and how its popularity in England took off in the 1590s. They then also discussed the possibility that Lord Burleigh could have commissioned a gift of 17 sonnets to the young Southampton as an encouragement for marriage. In fact, the 17 sonnets are known today as the procreation sonnets because they argue in favor of marriage. As to the question of who might have written them in 1590, Carol gave us some examples of sonnets written by the Earl of Oxford, who was Elizabeth the Vere's father, and another sonnet written by Christopher Marlowe. And we also examined sonnets written by others. Our consensus was that Marlowe's sonnet was clearly superior and that if one wanted to commission a batch of 17 sonnets, well, Marlowe would be the ideal candidate for the task. Peter, would you say that I have summarized the conclusions from our most recent episode?
Well, yes, Julian, I would say that about sums it up, yes.
Great. But, one thing is still bothering me. Carol pointed out that the so-called Marlowe sonnet is not so much a sonnet as a 14-line poem that fits the line count for a sonnet, but it lacks a rhyme scheme. I'm speaking of the sonnet found in Act 5 of Tamburlaine.
Yes, Act 5, Scene 1. But of course, sonnets don't actually have to rhyme, but this one certainly doesn't.
Well, that's actually what's bothering me, because do we have any other solid evidence that Marlowe was writing sonnets in 1590 or at any time, or at least something that we can attribute to him? Because otherwise, I think our conclusion seems a bit conjectural, don't you think?
Well, except we have more than that. We have this personal friend of his, John Harrington, saying in print that Marlowe was writing sonnets at the time.
Oh, wait a second. Are you talking about John Harrington, the inventor of the flush toilet?
Yeah, that's our man.
Oh, my goodness. Well, Sir John Harrington, courtier and contemporary of Marlowe's, who was apparently so famous in his day that he was memorialized as the character Jakes in Shakespeare's As You Like It.
Again, we should perhaps add at this point that Jakes was a common Elizabethan slang for privy, and of course Jakes and Jacques are similar enough that the groundlings would certainly have got the joke.
Yeah, imagine being famous for that.
So, Harrington, for whom the word John is named.
Exactly.
So, okay then, tell me, what does a man credited with one of indoor plumbing's most enduring contributions have to do with writing sonnets in 1590?
Well, Carol, I think you should explain. You seem to have this man under control.
Yes, well, Harrington, of course, as well as his ventures into plumbing, is also very well known as a writer for his letters, his epigrams, and many of his letters have survived. And over 400 of his epigrams were actually published in 1612 after he had died. He had a rather up and down court career. He was around from the mid 1580s until 1592, but on occasion he was banished by Queen Elizabeth for his behaviour, possibly for his epigrams getting far too close to the truth to be comfortable. And his punishment was to translate an Italian play called Orlando Furioso. This, of course, suited him down to the ground because it is an extremely risque play in places. However, the Queen, although he was irritating, he also found him extremely amusing, and eventually she relented and allowed him back to court. All the time this was going on, he was writing letters, writing epigrams, and many of the letters are dated. Many of them refer to actual people and events, so it's quite clear when they were written. The epigrams were a little different, though, because the epigrams, perhaps because some of them were really quite cutting, used pseudonyms, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not at all obvious who he was talking about in the epigrams.
So there's actually no smoking gun, no letter from Harrington to Marlowe itself?
No. But what you do have is a series of epigrams written about a person that he calls Faustus and his fascination with the sonnets. So, in fact, Harrington wrote 12 epigrams to this man Faustus, or about him. 5 of them discuss poetry, and 4 of those sonnets in particular discuss sonnets in particular. And his first mention of Faustus is in epigram number 37, and it's titled Comparison of the Sonnet and the Epigram. And I'll read it to you. Once by mishap, 2 poets fell a-squaring, the sonnet and our epigram comparing. And Faustus, having long demurred upon it, yet at the last gave sentence for the sonnet. Now for such censure, this his chief defense is, their sugared taste best likes his likeness senses. Well, though I grant sugar may please the taste, yet let my verse have salt to make it last. So, I love that thing. He claims that Faustus finds his epigrams too short, and he accuses him of stealing his verses. And then in a really clever sequence, he actually writes a sonnet, a 16-line Petrarchian sonnet, in answer to Faustus' complaint that he writes carelessly, and then answers that with an epigram, giving Faustus reply that now his epigrams are too long. And this is epigram number 208. He says, of Faustus the fault finder, of all my verses, Faustus still complains. I writ them carelessly. And why, forsooth? Because, he saith, they go so plain and smooth. It shows that I for them ne'er beat my brains. And then the next time he mentions Faustus is in epigram 220, which looks like Faustus' response to Harrington's sonnet in 208. Now, Faustus saith, long epigrams are dull.
Well, he doesn't actually say Marlowe. He says Faustus. Why do you think he means Marlowe?
Well, Faustus in those epigrams is quite obviously whoever else he is a poet. We don't know who translated the Faust book into English, but I don't think anyone's ever suggested he was a poet. And it's a little difficult to think of any other poet that we know of at the time who would be associated with Faustus.
Yeah, if you're asking yourself in that moment in time in 1590, who would you refer to as Faustus? Marlowe He's frequently referred to in the name of the characters that he's written about, not so much Barabbas, but certainly Tamburlaine and Faust. Those are two that come to mind. And he gives him other characteristics. Harrington gives this man other characteristics. He says he steals his lines, and that he quotes them to his mistress, and that he keeps better company than he is himself, and that he's a pickpocket.
Yes, pickpocket one's quite interesting because I was reminded the other day that one of Marshall's famous epigrams accuses somebody of effectively being a pickpocket and stealing dinner napkins every time he goes out. Marshall, the Roman poet, one of his favorite epigrams.
Well, this is just funny, and he's got this guy who's always got a snappy rejoinder, and he's got a really bright wit.
Yeah, a wit like a rapier, as Thomas Nash said of Marlowe.
Yeah, it fits with the standard description we have of Marlowe. He's a rogue, he gets into trouble, he plays tricks on people, he knows the better sort, the upper classes. He's not the bad guy the academics make him out to be, but he's not exactly an angel either. And if you're going to call somebody Faust and not really mean Marlowe, then that would really be confusing, because most people would automatically associate Faust with Marlowe. And if you're not talking about Marlowe, then don't refer to this person with an alias that immediately makes that comparison. You'd do better to find some other name to call that person.
Well, yes, and he doesn't struggle to do that in the other epigrams.
Right. Right. So now to get back to the sonnet, it seems to me that the existence of Harrington's conversation about, sonnets and writing sonnets and verses, what Harrington specializes in, which is the more lightweight stuff. And then you pull it out as you did, the sonnet from Tamburlaine. Anybody who wants to talk about Marlowe as being present up to 1593, if you're going to cut him off there, you still have to admit that Marlowe had a significant interest in sonnets, and that according to Harrington, if Marlowe is Faust, then he was practicing writing them at the time, being in 1589, 1590, which is when we're talking about this original set of sonnets being written to Southampton, and that if you were looking around the horizon for someone who has written a sonnet, who's any good at it, and you wanted to make a selection of who you wanted to give the commission to, so that that person could prepare 17 of them as a gift in order to coax somebody into marrying their granddaughter, well, who would you ask to do that? You've got the two that we've read, the one by Oxford and the one by Marlowe. One of them possibly written by Oxford, who's the granddaughter of Burleigh and the daughter of Oxford. And the other one is written by a man who's written the most popular play in all of London. And you just look at those two sonnets, which one strikes you? Even from a non-literary reader's point of view, which one is the more sophisticated and genuinely fascinating? The one by the father or the one by the professional?
Yes, and I think the other thing that's really significant, if Faustus in the epigrams is Marlowe, is where it positions Marlowe socially, because Harrington, although not an aristocrat, was the son of one of the Queen's ladies of the bedchamber, and the Queen was very fond of him because, as I think we mentioned earlier, although she rusticated him on occasions because she found his jokes too bawdy, she was also very fond of him. And the banishment was, in some respects, a token punishment. So Harrington was a person who had quite a lot of credit at court. He was a person of significance socially.
Yeah, I think that's significant. For Harrington to have known Marlowe, if they were crossing paths, this would be at court. So Marlowe now is traveling in that same sphere. And I love the business of him being at court and at simultaneously around town, in and out of brothels and so forth. And, did you steal his purse or did you steal his words? That's an allusion to a play. You sort of have Hamlet sitting right there.
Yes, yeah, and also this is really important. because one of the dismissals of Marlowe, especially by Oxfordians or other supporters of other aristocratic candidates, is that although he was very well educated, but he was only a working class boy. He didn't know people at court. He didn't know all the important aristocrats. Now, whether it is important that he knew them is another question. I'm not sure it is important, but the fact is it's not even true, because obviously he was on such good terms with Harrington that Harrington was writing epigrams about him, and some of those epigrams were obviously in response to writing things, maybe sonnets, maybe epigrams that we no longer have. And that's not a relationship between a master and a servant. It's a relationship between two friends. Friends, obviously, from very different social group backgrounds, but friends nevertheless.
Yeah, I would even say there's a kind of admiration that Harrington is expressing. You know, it's not like he's talking down to someone. He's talking to a person that he can joke with, and he knows that if this man chose to write about it, he's arguing with him about epigrams and sonnets, and he should use his wit to write a few epigrams and take a chance at it. And I'm not going to waste my time on that, Marlowe says, or Faustus says. So Harrington writes his own sonnet just to show him how to do it. And it's 16, not the 14 that ends up being a Shakespearean sonnet, but it's a sonnet. So Harrington treats his Faustus as an equal.
Yes, and that's important for all sorts of reasons, partly because it tells us that Faustus, who is likely to be Marlowe, wrote sonnets, and partly because it tells us that if Faustus is Marlowe, then Faustus was a person who moved in the upper echelons of society.
Yeah, and it also keeps him from the academic thing about Marlowe being an underworld character and untrustworthy and dirty. This removes him from all of that. It takes him out of the gutter and positions him inside another milieu altogether with people who wear nice clothes and talk politely. And he can carry that off at will. So the whole slander of Marlowe and the things that people have said about him goes out the window. He's a rogue, but he's a gentler rogue. And he makes a statement in here where he says, "We know you're no swordsman." So he's not somebody who's going to get into a street fight if he can help it.
How could you say the same thing about a glover's son?
I don't know. He wasn't there. He's not on the scene. You know, that's one thing that the book that I got these quotes from, this is one thing that it mentions very pointedly, is that Harrington never speaks of a person who could be associated with Shakespeare. He never uses the name, he never writes him a letter, and he never talks about someone that we could identify as being a quasi-Shakespeare. There's nobody standing around being Mr. Hamlet. There's nobody standing around being that other playwright. So it's very interesting, Harrington. He seems to be completely unaware of Mr. Shakespeare.
Well, just to play devil's advocate, we still don't know if that person is specifically Marlowe. I mean, he's not mentioned by name. You've got the tangential reference to Faustus, which I grant you is a very, very strong point, but we still don't know, or we can't specifically pinpoint that down to Marlowe, can we?
No, but somebody that Harrington called Faustus was writing sonnets and claiming he liked their sugared taste better than epigrams. And even though Mears said Shakespeare was famous for his sugared sonnets, he didn't write Dr. Faustus, so nobody could call him by that name.
Right. And there is another sonnet, this time a standard, standard if you think Shakespearean sonnets are standard, 14-line rhymed sonnet that might be by Marlowe.
Oh, really? Which one is that?
It's one of the sonnets in the preface to John Florio's Second Fruits, which was published in 1591. It's signed Phaeton, And of course, Florio, well known as the author of both Teach Yourself Italian books and as the Protestant tutor who Burley placed with Southampton. So that gives us another interesting connection to Southampton.
Can we actually assign that to Marlowe?
Yes, we can assign it to him, whether we'd be correct or not. But certainly Roy Erickson, a very respected Shakespeare scholar, made a strong case for the sonnet being by Marlowe. In the abstract for his article, he says, sonnet's imagery parallels that of two Marlovian paratexts, the epilogue in Dr. Faustus and Marlowe's dedication to Mary Sidney in Thomas Watson's Amino Gaudier. Maybe Peter would like to read the sonnet so we can get some idea of what it is.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to work on it, but I'll give it a try. Sweet friend, whose name agrees with thy increase, how fit a rival art thou of the spring! For when each branch hath left his flourishing, and green-locked summer's shady pleasures cease, she makes the winter's storm repose in peace, and spends her franchise on each living thing. The daisies sprout, the little birds do sing, herbs, gums, and plants do vaunt of their release. So when that all our English wits lay dead, except the laurel that is evergreen, thou with thy fruits our barrenness o'erspread, and set the flowery pleasance to be seen. Such fruits, such flowerets of morality, were ne'er before brought out of Italy. So that's pretty good. It's 14 lines. It's got a rhyme. It's got a couplet at the end. It has a reversal after line 8. I wouldn't mind, having that dedicated to me.
It plays very cleverly on the fact that the title of the book is Second Fruits, and that the author is Florio, a name that you could very easily associate with flower and floral, etc. So I think it brings those things very neatly.
So that would make at least 2 sonnets written in or before 1590 that we could attribute to Marlowe, which makes it a much stronger case that he could have written the first 17 of what we now know as Shakespeare's sonnets.
And Harrington's references to Faustus and the sonnets are in the same ballpark. And if you have all that, and I think you can make the case that the person who fits inside all those references and those exhibits would be exactly the type of person who wrote the first 17 sonnets, especially if they were written in 1590. And I think you can also make the case strictly on the basis of Burley's correspondence with the mother and the grandparents of Southampton and the attempt to marry his granddaughter on time, and who was present at that point in time and available, and the attempt to marry the granddaughter on time, and who was present at that point in time and available to make a gift of sonnets. If we can assume it was given as a gift, then
Yeah.
am I making sense here?
Yes, you are. I mean, I think it's difficult to make sense of sonnets 1 to 17 in any other context. You can certainly make arguments for the addressee being a different person, but the context is, I think, fairly inescapable that these were poems written to order, written on commission, and the purpose was to persuade the recipient, who was obviously a young unmarried man and 17 sonnets, age 17, to marry. And we can also assume that he was somebody in possession of a fortune, because, to misquote Miss Austen, really nobody would have bothered that much otherwise. It doesn't make sense in any other circumstances.
Well, we're framing this in the context of Burley's search for a husband for wealth and for his granddaughter, and not separating the needs of wealth and marriage of the granddaughter and to however she might have felt about it. But if she felt anything, or that's a context that exists for these people. But if you raise a point that it remains a question as to whether or not those 17 sonnets were in fact written as a gift for Southampton.
Yes, and that's a crucial question. Was he the addressee? And as we spoke about in the previous episode, in terms of the decision to write them as sonnets, it fits with that. It fits with Southampton in a way it simply doesn't work, say, for William Herbert.
No, he's too young.
Yeah, it would be too late. By the time William Herbert was 17, sonnets would have seemed terribly passé, especially to a fashionable young man of 17.
Right. I mean, the only thing you're left with is just saying, well, then he just did it for a lark.
I don't really think they're that sort of poetry. It's
Well, yeah, but that's a judgment. That's a judgment. I don't know where that stands in a court of law. If somebody wanted to argue that context notwithstanding, if we remove the context, which the context is real, it's real. Burleigh wanted Southampton to marry his granddaughter. That's true. But if we remove that, then is there anything internal to the sonnets that actually indicates any of that? We've given a couple of good reasons, but the popularity of them at that point of time, who is the most likely to have the kind of profile of the person who received them, who's the person most capable of doing it. So we have suspects for all of that, and for somebody who would commission. And those are a set of assumptions, and they're reasonable, but they're not essential. And in the creative act, they're not essential. So you're still sitting here with this isolated group of 17 sonnets, and others are going to insist that we don't know who wrote them or why.
Yes, except I think you can say, simply from looking at the contents of those 17 sonnets, that they have a clear purpose. They're designed to persuade the addressee to marry, because every single one of those sonnets harps on that theme. There is no let up. You should get married. And usually the rationale given is because you should get married because you are so handsome and attractive. And so it would be a dreadful waste if you didn't get married and have a son who wasn't handsome and attractive, etc., etc. And that is what makes them a group, to my mind, the fact that every single one has essentially the same theme. There's very little variation in the expression, but not in the theme.
Yeah, but then so are Hallmark cards, congratulations on your graduation from high school and so on. And you can pick them out whenever you go to the store. And let's say I'm over, at St. Paul's and I'm wandering around the stalls and I'm thinking, have you got something that'll help me convince somebody to marry my granddaughter? And yeah, sure, I got 17 of them. Pick one. You like this one? No, I'll try this one. And so we have a context that we like, but other people are going to say no. So it seems like we have to delve deeper into the sonnets themselves to ask, what do they say to us that makes them what we think they are?
Well, one of the other things that very much differentiates them from most of the other sonnets is they are not personal in any way, shape or form, which many of the other sonnets are. Obviously excluding the last two because they're translations, but in the vast majority of the others, the author is writing about himself, and he's writing about himself from a very personal and internal viewpoint. And the first 17 are simply not like that. They are not remotely personal. And then you get to sonnet 18, shall I compare thee? And suddenly he's writing from a very personal point of view.
Yeah. That's good. That's like, it's like a switch goes on all of a sudden. And somebody could turn around and say, well, this is a good case being made for the sonnets being written just to write them with no purpose at all. And yet you can take that same argument and reverse it, and it makes just as much sense. They were written for a purpose. The purpose is clearly stated in the sonnet. And the only thing you need to find is the appropriate person to receive them, which is sort of like the Jane Austen comment. It wouldn't just be anybody. It has to be somebody you take the time to do this for. So the fact that there's a universality to them, that's part of their charm and part of the reason that they would be given as a gift, because then they would be composed together. So we should think of them that way. And I think when you get to who else was doing it, you have Tamburlaine's semi-sonnet, which is definitely by Marlowe, and you have the Phaeton, which is attributed to Marlowe, and you have Harrington, whose description of interaction with this Faustus character fits the character of Marlowe more specifically than anybody else. Then you have the context and the players in the same place at the same time. And that is before we get to the significant parallels, which I'm suggesting we take under in the 17 sonnets between Hero and Leander and Venus and Adonis.
Well, it's funny you should say that. I was already wondering if there are connections between the Procreation sonnets and other works by Marlowe. For example, as you mentioned, Hero and Leander and Venus and Adonis. But as you have said, time is up. And I must say, I'm always very impressed by what we come up with in every episode with all these different twists and turns. And I can't wait till our next episode to explore the provocative idea that you have just mentioned. And I'm sure that you too will have more surprises in store for us. Be sure to tune in to our next episode of Hidden in Plain Sight. And if you want to jump ahead, don't forget to pick up a copy of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that inspired all of this. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next week.